Today we've got Sheldon Thomas, who's going to speak in a minute. You can see him now. Look, there he is, and he's smiling. And he's going to speak shortly. Sheldon actually runs a Gangs Line, which is an incredible organisation which works with gangs, and they do have a website, and there's a link to it there. If you go to the website, you'll see what they're all about. You can see what they're doing. You can see the training and development activities that they're doing. And they do a lot of work with the police, with local authorities, with others. And they provide a great resource of help for those people who are trying to confront this problem. And I know Sheldon will be willing to work with any of you if you wanted more help on this. Anyhow, I'm going to go over to Sheldon now, and he's going to make his presentation and go around and talk about gang culture, radicalization, why young people join gangs, why they're connected by radicals who influence them, what happens then, and what we can do about it. So Sheldon, perhaps you'd like to start by telling us a little bit about yourself and then go into the presentation. Anyhow, thank you for doing this and for joining us today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sheldon Thomas. I'm a former gang member, and for the last 27 years, I've been engaging gang members up and down this country and in parts of the Caribbean, as well as in America. And that was my speciality, engaging gang members. What we've learned over the 27 years is that things is slowly moving in terms of the way gang members go through the gang process and come out the other end and end up in prison and mental institutions. But what we found when we looked at gang members that were going into prison, you know, some going on long-term going over a long period of time, maybe over 7-10 years or so, looking at murder or manslaughter. What we found when we went into prisons, and this is what prisoners were telling us when they were either coming out, was that there was a very influential Muslim sect of people within the prisons that was deliberately recruiting young men who were involved in gangs. And at first we didn't realize what the connection was, because obviously it was new to us. We didn't take much notice of it because we just thought maybe they were finding their God, so to speak. But obviously what's happened over the last few years, we have seen quite a few young men getting caught up in the way Muslims are attracting them and radicalizing them in the prisons. When they come out, they may not go back to the gang life, but then join their Muslim brothers. But that's just one aspect of it. But today we're gonna explore how young men get caught up in gangs, the mentality behind it, and how that is connected and linked with radicalization as well. Because it isn't just radical Muslims as well. We have situations up north where young white males, white underclass, are also radicalized by the far right groups who have their own ideology. So today's process is going to look at how young men get caught up in gang violence. We're going to look at the geographical profile. That means the size of the problem, because you know, some of you may not be coming from just London. We want people to understand that gangs is a UK problem, and it isn't just a London problem, like sometimes the media likes to portray. So what we're going to do is look at this first slide, which says the geographical profile. And as you can see, I've split it into north, south, east, and west. And this is by no means a definitive names of all the gangs, because gang members change fluently. They're 1 minute they could be called Tottenham Mandem. This is a gang from up north, TMD, from north of London. And tomorrow they could be called something else. So this is not a definitive list, because gang members change all the time. Today we have 50 gangs, tomorrow you've got 100. The day after you've got 150, because young men often fight against each other, split up and form new gangs and recruit younger gang members. So that's a geographical profile. This could be replicated in any city within the UK. So for instance, you'll have gangs gangs in Nottingham, Sheffield, Liverpool, Leeds, Manchester, Middlesbrough, Newcastle, Cardiff. Gangs are everywhere. It isn't just centered on London, and it isn't just young black kids or young Asian kids. Everybody involved in gangs that can be involved in gangs will come from a vulnerable background, maybe a broken family. So any child that is coming from particular deprived communities can and will be attracted to gangs. So people need to understand it isn't a black problem like they like to portray in London. It's a UK problem amongst all young people. And it isn't just from young people from broken families. We're now finding families from middle class areas also attracted to gang violence due to the music that they're listening to. So any young person that is vulnerable, that feels that they need a sense of belonging because there's no connection with their parents, they will be attracted to gangs. So if we go to the next slide. So if you go back one, right, if we look at this slide, this is, we call it the postcode trap. And again, this applies in any area, in any city, in any inner city as well. And what you have here are grey spots, and these grey spots define the estates that are in this particular area, and this area happen to be Hackney. And so these grey spots are not just estates, but these also have the names of the gangs that are attached to that estate. And as you can see, some of the estates where the grey spots are very close to other grey spots where the other estates are. What that tells you is that young men and involved in this lifestyle are so easily trapped, they can't even leave the estate that they're on. And in some cases, can't even leave come out their front door in some cases, because if you're not involved in gangs and you're living on one of these estates, the chances are you may not want to come outside because you don't want to get involved with the gangs that are outside your front door, because many of these young people on these estates are not involved in gangs. And what happens is they get trapped and get caught up in that lifestyle. So for instance, if we look at one of the gangs in Hackney called Holly Street Boys, and we look at the gang which is right opposite them called the London Fields Boys, London Fields Gang. These two gangers had conflict for the last 15, maybe 17, 18 years. And you could have a young man who's never been involved in gangs who lives on that estate in Holly Street. But because he lives on that estate, he gets caught up in that senseless violence. So if he gets caught into another area, which they call slipping, if he gets caught in another area, the chances are he could either be stabbed or shot because he is associated with that estate, even though he is not a gang member. So we're talking about young men, not just a small minority of young men caught up in this lifestyle. We're talking about a majority of young men between the ages of 10 to 25 who live on particular estates, who may not be involved in gangs, are also caught up in this lifestyle because they live on a particular estate that is known for a particular gang. Also, we need to look at the fact that some of these young men have to travel on several buses just to get to their destination. Because if they travel through a gang area, they too will be targeted by other gangs. So traveling within some of these areas becomes very risky. Now, the point that I'm trying to say is that gangs isn't just what people think it is, a bunch of kids just standing on a corner. It's a way of life. It's a lifestyle that runs alongside the normal lifestyle. It's a parallel world. It's a world that is far removed from our world, that has got different rules and is run by different ways of thinking. And what we may think is normal, they don't think is normal. What they think is normal, you definitely won't think is normal. How they get to school is a struggle. How these people live on a daily basis is a struggle. How they think is often bordering on personality disorder. So we're talking about kids that are living in households, that families are broken, that the deprivation on these estates is very high, most of these gang members live in households where there are no father figures at all, or no positive male role models. So these young men can easily be coerced by radicalizations, by young people that have different ideology. Because how you've got to look at this lifestyle is that these young kids are vulnerable children, regardless of whether they're committing acts of violence or not, or selling drugs. They're vulnerable children coming from a vulnerable background. And the attraction of gangs is just one aspect. The attraction of other things like ideologies, such as the far right or radicalized, is also another attraction for maybe the older gang members who may be getting fed up of being arrested, maybe fed up of going to prison, and are looking for another sense of belonging, something else they can call a family. And in some cases, it's the far right, and in other cases, it's radicalized Muslims. And what we have to understand is the grooming process, which we'll go into later. But what I want you to do now is to look at a video that kind of describes how some of these young men think and why they think the way they do, so that you can begin to understand what is happening in their minds. How do they think and why they think the way they do? And before we go on, so if we look at the this next clip.
It's just crime. It's everywhere.
There's no safety anywhere really in London.
Yo, every day someone's getting mashed up or shot or something.
I feel neglected, you know, raised in Tottenham, like things isn't easy around now.
If you can stab someone, obviously you must have some sort of bollocks, like you got some balls in you. So by the drawing of someone's blood in war, it's like, yeah, you're down now. It's almost like you're blooding when people are fuck something and whatnot. That's your blooding. You've done it. You know what I'm saying? You're authentic. You're not just talking it. You're walking it as well.
That government, what they got going on is rubbish. They're not here to help us. The only thing they've gave to help the black youths of today is prison. It's the only thing they've gave.
So you don't want to be socially excluded, you want to fit in where you're from. And if where you're from's hell, then you're going to turn into the devil to fit in. And I think that's what a lot of people don't seem to understand.
Like, me personally, nobody's going to help me but me. No mayor or MP or prime minister, no, but they can't help me.
I personally feel like with the knife crime and stuff like that, if they really want to prevent it, like the living standards of certain people, especially estates like this, they need to make it better. So people feel like they're not living in hell and they don't need to become devils, and everything is not materialistic. They say the devil wears Prada, and all my friends are in Prada. It's a cool thing to be in, you know what I mean? So it's like, that's what it's all about here.
Everyone sells drugs nowadays, little freaking 14-year-olds, 13-year-olds are selling drugs, like, so that's what it's, drugs and knives and guns really.
And it becomes a fashion, like to have a mobile phone. You have your knife, you got your mobile, you got your weed, and I know it's not acceptable, I know it's not the right thing to do, and everybody knows it's not the right thing to do, but because they feel they belong, and they feel it's a place where they have a certain identity, and all those people condone it and people accept them for it, even if their family excludes them, they find a new family, and their family is the street.
Go to the police is just something like, it's just a no-no, innit? It's just something you don't do, innit? And it's like the way we've been brought up, innit? I know it's bad, but that's how it is for us, innit? And I doubt it's going to change for a very long time, innit?
Even all young males at the moment, it's all about pride. And if you can fit into that circle, that pride, like a lion has its pride, you feel comfortable, you feel like you belong to something.
We all want to achieve things. Some of us want to be mechanics, sportsmen, musicians, we all got dreams. No one wants to be a shotter for the rest of their life.
I personally feel my school was shit because we was told it was shit. We was always told that statistically this is one of the worst schools in London. And I look around and it's full of black kids. So I'm thinking, fuck, I'm fucked.
Now, some of you looking at the video will think, well, these guys look quite old. They can explain themselves in a certain way. But what we have to understand is that for these young men to express themselves the way they did means they've gone through so much stuff that they've reached the end of their tether, so to speak. In other words, they've had enough of this lifestyle, but they don't know what to do about it. They don't know how to deal with changing that circumstance that they're in. And what we have to also understand is that the generation below them is even far more younger. And as the generations get younger, the violence increases. So what we need to look at is the vulnerability of children or the vulnerability of adults, because in the same way young children are groomed into gangs, it is the same way older guys are groomed into radicalization, whether it be the far right, whether it be fundamental Muslims or whatever it be. But they both have a situation that is happening in our society that we're not addressing, because we're trying to look at radicalization and gangs as a separate issue. We're trying to think that the way gangs work is separate to the way radicalized groups work, and they don't, because they both go after vulnerable children or vulnerable adults. That's what they do. Now, they may do it in different sense. So for instance, the far right may target white young kids, whereas the Muslims will target white kids as well as black kids, mainly in the prison systems, because in the prisons is where many of the grooming takes place, where many of the initiation takes place. What we also need to look at as well is some of the activities that gang members get up to that actually causes their incarceration, like the drug dealing, the robbery, the fraud, the prostitution, the selling of ammunition. This is called grinding and trapping. For those who don't understand, they have their own terminology. So if we look at some of their terminologies, if we go to the next slide, if we look at their terminology, for their activities, they have a different description for the activities they do, but it's in their language. And one of the things I always say to people that wants to understand gangs, want to understand the young people of today, you have to understand their language. Because if you don't understand their language, it's going to be difficult for you to engage with them. Now, no one's saying that you need to speak like them. What I am trying to say is that they have their own language, like they've got their own code. They've got their own rules. They have their own lifestyle. Their world runs alongside ours. So their language runs alongside ours. And if you look at some of the words that they've got here, these are considered old. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show you some more up-to-date words. So if we look at these words, you can see from the first slide that I put with the street slang that the words are slightly different for the same thing. And the words consistently changes. And one of the reasons why the words consistently changes is because the age group of the young people involved is getting younger and younger. And what we have to do, we no longer can associate gangs with the average 17, 18-year-old. We've got to look at gangs in different spheres. So for instance, the average gang member's age now is 13, 14. Many years ago, when I was involved in a gang back in the 70s, the average was 21, 22. But now what you've got to understand is that things are changing, not only socially, but it's changing through the media and the music that they listen to. So the age group is getting far younger, and that's why the language changes so consistently. And so it's important for us as workers or for professionals, for anyone engaging with young people who are coming from a vulnerable background, we need to understand their language. We need to understand them. We need to understand what they are living, what their life experience, because there is no point trying to change somebody if you don't understand them. Because, for instance, if they come from Rwanda, so we have many Africans involved in gangs in London, and if they come from a particular area like Rwanda, you need to understand what it means coming from Rwanda, which is a war-torn area, which is civil unrest, which means that a young person may have grown up in an environment where murders take place on a regular basis. So the mindset of a young man involved coming from Rwanda most probably be different from a young kid born to African Caribbean parents here in London, because for him to kill somebody may not be nothing new to him because of his experiences of where he's come from. But if you don't understand the cultural differences within the young people involved in the gangs, whether they be white underclass, whether they be Asian, whether they be Black Caribbean, Black African, then you're going to end up trying to do a one size fits all, and that cannot work. So let's go to the next slide. Now, this is really important because this is where radicalized groups as well as street gangs really come into their own. They have got the art of really grooming young people. And this is something that we're slow to understand because we're trying to separate the two. We're trying to make gangs to be a separate issue from radicalized groups, and they're not. Gangs are dealing with economic, they want to make money, they want to make fast money very quickly, and they don't care how they do it. Radicalized groups have an ideology to spread, an ideology that they want to recruit more young people involved in their ideology so that they can spread more of their ideology around. There is no different. The difference is one is doing it through an economic means, that means drug dealing and other aspects of illegal money gains, and the other is doing it through an ideology, a belief system. A system that they believe by getting more young people involved can spread their belief further across in the UK. They're the same. They attract and go for vulnerable children just the same as gang members, no different. You can see them up and down looking and going around the different estates. It's so easy to find young people who are coming from vulnerable backgrounds these days because there are so many deprived estates, so many broken families. We're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of broken families up and down this country, regardless of race, up and down this country, that these groups, gangs, radicalized groups are having a field day. Because we're not understanding that the attraction or the grooming process is operating exactly the same as if they were gangs. And that's what we need to understand. These groups go after vulnerable children. And it doesn't matter what the race is. It doesn't matter what background they come from, because what they want to do is spread their evil, whether it be gangs through drug dealing and whether it be radicalized groups. Let's go to the next slide. That the initiation can be working both ways. When we look at the initiation of gang members, that means we're talking about the leader of the gang will tell the young person to go and commit a robbery, maybe go and commit some acts of violence. The same initiation will take place with radicalized groups. And what we have to understand is that if we want to stop gangs and we want to stop radicalization, the only way to stop it is to change the way Britain thinks about broken families. We have to understand that the reason why we're in this position is that we have broken families. And unless we change that, unless we look at our broken family, unless we look at our society and ask ourselves questions, how are we going to change the values of families so that these families do not remain broken, do not remain in a place where the estates are sinking, the estates are so bad that police can't go there, anyone can't go there, it's a no-go area. How are we going to change that? Because that is the only way you're going to stop gangs and radicalization, by changing families, because that is at the heart of this matter. The interventions can't work if the young person has still got to go back home to a broken family. It cannot work. So let's go to the next slide. Now, here we're going to talk about the gang mentality. And we call it gang mentality at Gangs Line for a reason, because gang mentality talks about the psychological factors within gang members that no one addresses. Because what we tend to do when we look at young people caught up in radicalizations or young people caught up in gangs, we tend to look at the outwardly approach, i.e. what they've done, whether they've tried to build a bomb, whether they've tried to sell drugs or shot somebody or stabbed somebody or kidnapped somebody, or they've committed some sexually explicit exploited some girl sexually. We look at the outwardly things of what they do, but we don't actually address the psychological factors of what gang members actually go through. So if we look at this list, this is just a basic list of what a gang member really looks like. The emotional trauma. Many gang members, especially from Black and ethnic minority, experience domestic violence at a very early age when they're in their house, either from their stepdad beating up on their mum or stepdad abusing them. They experience it at a very young age. So seeing violence in some family homes is become normalized. So they grow up thinking that that way of life is normal. Rejection. Some of these kids are rejected by their fathers, rejected. They feel rejected at home. They don't feel a sense of love within the family unit. So they feel rejected, and not just rejected from the family, but they feel rejected from society itself. If we look at loneliness, we see gang members walking around in 5s, 10s, 15, 20 members. Sometimes we see them in their videos. There's 20 of them in a video, 30 of them. Believe me, make no mistake, they are lonely. And I'll tell you why I know this, because I've experienced this myself. As a former gang member, I experienced that even though I had many men, young people around me, I was lonely because no one understood me. I felt I didn't feel a part of my family. And when you don't feel a part of your family, you're looking for something else, but you actually know that the people that you're with are not actually your family. And they're really deep down, that is not what you're looking for. And so there comes a sense of loneliness, a sense of you're alone in this. And that's actually a critical state, because that can lead to other things. If we look at anger and hatred and fear, all of those things are some of the fundamental problems that our young men go through and young women go through coming from this background. But these are the things that we don't discuss. These are the things we don't talk about, because it's easy for us to look at the outwardly stuff, the things they do, rather than how have they got here? How did they arrive? How can it become so easy for them to be attracted to gangs, to radicalized groups? How easy is it? And this is the reason why. Because when you have all of these psychological factors going through a young person or a young adult, it makes it easy for them to fall into radicalized groups or gangs and to go out and live that lifestyle because of all of this confusion that they're going through in their lives. Now, what we need to talk about is some solutions, because highlighting the problem is one thing. But how do we deal with it? Well, I gave you some of the answers at the beginning by saying that this can only be done by us fixing families. Now, I know many people may not agree with that, but what we have to understand at the heart of all of this, all the young men caught up in this lifestyle, all the young women caught up in this lifestyle, if you look at a majority of them, over 90% of them come from broken families. And if you look at that figure, there is a direct correlation and a link between those people caught up and incarcerated in prison, coming from broken families. And we have a small percentage coming from middle-class families now because of the music they're listening to. And again, because of the YouTube experience, many of these middle-class kids are listening to these gangster rap, are listening to these gangster grime music, are listening to a lot of these stuff and actually reenacting it in their own lives because they think of it as fun. And so we've got not just kids from deprived backgrounds, living this gang mentality, but we have young people who are coming from well-to-do backgrounds who also have this gang mentality because they feel it's all fun and they feel that they are a part of something. And a lot of young people don't want to be left out of something. They feel it's all fun, so I want to be a part of it. So here are some solutions. If we click the first 4, so if we do the next one and the next 2. Now, for many of you, you may have done your degree in social work and DIPS as well. Maslow's hierarchy of need is a theory that's been used since 1948. And I know some people may not like this and some people may not agree with it because you may think it's quite dated. But I'm a great believer that when I looked at this the very first time many years ago, I realized that what Maslow was actually trying to say is that the basis of life itself is family. He was actually saying that if a child does not have its biological and psychological needs met, the chances are it won't succeed in life. If the child doesn't feel safe in their environment, that will cause instability. If the child doesn't feel any family affection, no relationships with their parents, and no love in the house, they will look elsewhere for that. If the child feels that he can't achieve in society, he can't get anywhere, and he has no status, he or she will look elsewhere for that. And when I looked at these fundamentals, these 4 fundamental principles, and I know Maslow's hierarchy of needs goes higher, but I'm just looking at these 4 basic ones because I feel that these are where we need to be at to begin with. We have to understand that in order for us to make changes, in order for us to change the gang situation, in order for us to change radicalized groups, or for young people not to get attracted to radicalized groups, we've got to change families' thinking. We've got to change the way families are made up these days. And I'm not suggesting for 1 second where I'm talking about the father needs to be in the house. I'm saying that we need to create an environment where fathers are held accountable for their children. In other words, it's not so easy for them to just walk out the family home and take no responsibility. But at the same time, we also need families to understand the importance of building strong relationships with your children. Because when your child does not feel a sense of belonging, a sense of love at home, they will look elsewhere for that. And that is where the attraction of gangs and the attractions of radicalized groups fills that void. It fills that void because they feel, even though they don't know it, that, oh, this is love. They don't realize it isn't real love because they don't realize these groups are using them. But when you're young and you've got so many psychological issues, it is hard for you to understand that you're being used in that way. So what we have to understand is that if we want to fix this problem, we have to fix families. You cannot fix this problem by coming up with interventions that excludes the family, that doesn't look at how can we build strong families so that young people are not attracted so easily to gangs and so easily to radicalized groups.
I mean, we've got some local authority people on here. We've got some questions coming up already, which is great. But we've got some local authority people here as well. If you were working with a local authority, you are perplexed to know very often what to do and how to confront this situation. You often don't feel you've got the roots in the communities that you're talking about, the new families that are created in gangs. What can you say to local authorities that they can do to help address this problem?
Well, the first thing the local authorities have to do is have to have the right people around the table, because one of the problems is that they don't form the right partnership groups with the right people from the community or the right third sector organizations, because third sector organizations that are in local communities are more likely to know and understand the problems of young people than a local authority who are not in the community as much. So one of the things that I would say to local authorities that they need to do is to form good partnerships with the local community, whether it be the third sector groups and faith groups, so that they can begin to bottom out some of the issues coming from the community. Secondly, what they also need to do is that they need to have an outreach team that goes out and engages on these estates, because part of the problem is that they don't, where the youth service had a very good outreach team of people going out on these estates, there is no longer anyone engaging with these young people in a positive way. So what you do need, as well as forming strong partnerships with the third sector, faith groups and people in the community, as well as the local authority and the police, what you also need is a team of workers that go out on particular estates to engage with young people on a consistent basis, so that at all times, young people are getting positive engagement from older people from within the community, as well as getting a strategic view of how the local authority are going to work in partnership with the local, with the third sector groups and faith groups to strategically deal with this problem.
But when they do that, I mean, local authorities might be quite good at getting the structures right, or getting the people there, maybe finding the funding, though that's difficult nowadays. But the issue of actually how you engage is a difficult one, isn't it? Because, you know, they come from a sort of organizational culture going to an estate culture. How can we help local authorities to know how to engage the right way, use the right language, adopt the right narrative?
Well, one of the things is training. For instance, Gangsline does a training about engagement of young people. But one of the things I would advocate at all times is that you still would need more than just that, because training staff is one thing, but you do need a team of people that are ready to go out there. And that's why I was advocating that it's important that local authorities actually look at ways of funding an outreach team, as well as getting the consistent training that is necessary. So training is one way, which is what Gangsline do. We offer that training. So training local authority staff about how to engage, and around some of the stuff that we shared today, so that it gives them an understanding of the cultural differences between the gangs, and giving them a clearer understanding of what is going through the minds of some of these young people.
Owen actually said he's really interested in this engagement issue. And do you have any examples of good practice that you could tell us about?
Well, the good practice would have been Gangsline. We did an engagement in Newham for about 3 years straight. Well, it's a bit longer than that, actually, but it was consistent for 3 years. And we engaged with every single gang within Newham. And the reason why we was able to do that is that the funding was there for that to happen. So having us going out and engaging with the gang members became easy because the funding was there. We was already set up. We're all former gang members, so we already have a buy-in to most gang members in that borough. So for us, we were kind of contracted to engage the gang members specifically in Newham. So if I was to talk about good practice, you could use that as a good practice of an organization that has already done that piece of work. But the reason why I'm advocating training is that I realized us going out isn't enough, because we're not a big organization. We're not like some of the bigger organizations across the country. We're a very small organization. So we believe in sustainability. We believe that if you train people to do what you do, then you're creating a sustainable approach to dealing with it through the local authority.
Tariq is saying that maybe, and I think he's saying this, that maybe local authorities or professionals have a wrong approach. They've got a rather personal, individual-centric model. They're looking at psychological deficiencies, and they're not looking at the sociological model, which you've been talking about the culture of gangs.
Yeah.
Do you accept that, or do you think he's wrong?
No, I think he's right. Obviously, local authorities have always had a different standpoint, a different view, and a different approach. This is why I'm advocating the training, because the training will actually show them that the way they've been doing it is not being the right way, and the way to do it is the way that our training delivers. So he's right when he says what he's saying. Of course he's right, but that's the reason why our training program is there. Specifically, we've identified that local authorities don't understand the culture of gangs, do not understand the cultural differences within the gangs. So we've developed a training for that purpose.
Michelle earlier said a question which is quite interesting, is that is there any way in which we can spot early vulnerabilities in people by their behavior, the way they behave? And is there any way in which intervention can take place that early, or is that asking too much?
No, there is ways, normally at primary school level. The problem has been is that primary schools are not always keen at really wanting to go down that route, because they tend to want to wait for an incident to happen. These children show these signs well before they become teenagers. that I believe that the signs are shown from 9, 10, maybe that age group, that you can see that there are signs. The signs normally are the young person that is very quiet. Because in the a few years ago, we used to go for the young person that made the most noise in the class, or make a person that was distracting everybody in the class. That's not the case with a lot of the young guys now. What you may find is that the guy is very quiet, the girl are far removed, and what that young person is the instigator. What happens is he's the one that is underlining what's happening in the school, but he's never the one that's getting into trouble for it, because he has a way of being able to cause a lot of problems within schools, but never being identified as the reason, because he actually does his schoolwork, he actually sits in class and doesn't cause any problems. So identifying a child can become very difficult depending on what school. So for instance, the child that is always tired is another way. A child that is not well kept is another way. Why? Because these guys are out late at night. We've got young kids at age 12, 13 that are up till 12, 2 o'clock in the morning out on the estates. And when they're coming to school, they're tired, they don't look good, they haven't eaten. So there's different ways of identifying them, but normally it's behavior. Behavior is normally the giveaway, that they're bullying people in the school, that they not only bullying people, people seem to flock around them. That's another way of identifying them. When these kids have a lot of kids flocking around them, you know there's something not quite right there.
You mentioned about the importance of families, and I put commas around that. Some people are saying, and James has asked this question, he asked it in the last webinar. I mean, when children are in care and they come out of care, in and out of care, are they likely to be more vulnerable very often than others? I mean, have you found an experience about that, about children in care and their susceptibility to radicalisation?
Children in care are targeted a lot. In fact, they're the most targeted group because they are the most vulnerable group. Because again, they're away from their family structure. They're amongst other kids that have got similar issues. So yes, children in care, we know that most children's homes in London have been targeted by gangs. These guys are easily susceptible to gangs and being radicalized. So when we talk about children care, that's the reason why I've always said, I do not think it's a good idea for children to go into care, because I think foster caring is better, because children in care are targeted quite a lot and deliberate by gangs and radical groups.
Okay, and I guess there are problems with fostering as well that have come up recently, but I understand what you're saying. And Michelle is also saying, very interestingly, I mean, you mentioned the importance of family and everything like that, but how do you sort of get people out of the bubble they're in when they're in gangs, when their families have broken up, when they're, they're maybe suffering mental health or drug problems themselves, and the family support that you are talking about that's necessary isn't there yet. I mean, you're hoping it will be, but it's not there yet. So what do you do in the interim period? How can you help them when the structures you would like to have don't exist?
Well, with that question there, it's a difficult one, but there's one we can approach which we don't seem to use a lot, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is CBT, and also therapeutic approach, because this is where I believe that we fail in the prison systems, because in the prison systems we don't have the therapeutic approach necessary, and the ones we do have, they are not relative to the prison inmates. So for instance, if you go into a prison in London and the percentage of the prisoners in London is 70% Black Caribbean or Black African and only 30% white, then you have a therapist who is white middle class. You're unlikely to get a Black guy who is going through a series of problems to actually open up to that person. Now, I'm not saying that happens in every single scenario. That's an example that if we don't get the right people in who are culturally relative to the people they're dealing with, then we're not going to make changes. Now, when we talk about communities and actually families, how do we get that? One, I think communities have to address the problems as a community, and they are not. Communities tend to blame. So when you look at the white working class communities up north or the black communities down south, there's a lot of blame of everyone else, but not looking within. So part of the problem is unless we can get communities to start acknowledging their role, their responsibility, what is happening to their children, mentally wise, psychological wise, we're unlikely to make the changes necessary as professionals, because you can't break that barrier down because the communities are unwilling to accept their responsibility, their role and their part to play in it.
I mean, you mentioned cognitive therapy. Does that take us along Mayor's point as well, that mentoring is also important? And what do we mean by the right sort of mentoring that can make a link between local authorities and youth projects?
I mean, mentoring is a very good approach. But again, the person has to be culturally relative. And it's also important when you're mentoring is that young people want to feel that you've gone through what they've gone through. They want to know you understand them, because a lot of mentors come with goodwill. But these gang members, these young people who are coming from these vulnerable backgrounds, they don't want goodwill. They want to know you understand them. You understand where they're coming from. In other words, you've got to either have experienced it or you have some clear understanding, you've lived in that environment. Because what we tend to have is mentors with goodwill, which is fine and may can work in some instances. But when you're looking at people who are coming from a particular background, such as maybe the white working class, who are generational involved in criminality, they would want people, or they need people that understands that generational approach, that understands what it means to come from a family of generational criminals. So it's important to have the right mentors that goes along with that young person.
And as you said earlier, it's important also to work with the right sort of organizations who understand the different cultures like yours, but they're not always there. I mean, they're sometimes few and far between in some areas, and getting those organizations like yours is very difficult. And Peter Feltham says it may be a funding problem. I mean, how are organizations like yours and people doing good work like yours funded?
Well, for us, we've developed a training where we get people to pay for our training course. So we fund ourselves indirectly, because we've realized that you can't rely on government funding. So we run a limited company that is a consultancy and training company, and so it allows us to go out and we will get people to pay to come on our training course. That's one way of doing it. You have to find other areas, because we can't rely on funding as one stream, because funding is here today and gone tomorrow. And that's what we've realized as an organization with our foundation. So we don't rely on government money anymore. We rely on our training, my consultancy. So I do a lot of consultancy work for local authorities, for different governments, where they pay me to come in and consult for them around the gang issues and stuff like that. That's how we do it. And we believe that is the way forward. We believe that you cannot sit here relying on funding, where a lot of organizations, that's what they tend to do. Hence why they fold and they don't last long.
Roshni asks a question about a growing concern that there are a lot of female gangs happening. I mean, how prevalent are female gangs in this? And are we seeing a really change in the gender differentiation between gang violence and the links between the genders?
Well, we have not come across girl gangs, standalone girl gangs. What we've come across are lots of girls associated with individual gang members. So an example would be, so if we have one of the gangs from North London, TMD, for an example, and say they have 50 members in that group, in that gang, each one of those members will have at least 5 or 6 girls linked to them individually. And so the links, through those links, those girls are used in various capacities. Some are used as wifey, some are used as side chicks, some are used to sell drugs, some are used to carry the weapons. So it would appear to the outside person who doesn't understand the structures of gangs that, oh, maybe girls are involved in gangs or girls run gangs themselves. They don't. Girls do not bring drugs in. Girls do not organize themselves and control estates like what the boys do. Girls do not go out and start selling drugs without the knowledge of the male members of the gang. So we need to be very careful that we're not trying to push out, because we're not where America is. In America, there are girl gangs. In South America, Guatemala, and other places, there are girl gangs. There's no doubt about that. But in the UK, what we have is lots of girls associated with individuals within gangs who work on behalf of the gang to make money for that gang.
I mean, a lot of these gang members often are in and out of prison, aren't they, for all sorts of different reasons. And it's one way in which local authorities might be able to help is looking at rehabilitation, which is woeful at the moment. I mean, people come out of prison, they don't get support, they don't get the help they need. Should local authorities be looking at that a lot more in order to provide the support that people need when they do come out of prison?
Of course, no doubt. That's where I think we're failing as well as a society, that we're not understanding what prison stands for. Prison is supposed to be a place of rehabilitation. That is not what's happening. We have gang members going in and coming out worse than when they went in. Part of the reason why is because the prison service have not acknowledged that they do not understand gang culture. And because they have not acknowledged it, it means that they don't get the right service in those prison systems to deliver the right rehabilitation work that is necessary. For instance, the mentoring, the therapeutic approach. Those are the things that needs to be in prisons that will help with these young people to be rehabilitated back into society. And there's not enough of that. When they come out of prisons, they are almost just left there to say, fend for yourself. Now, I know some people may think that's okay because you went into prison, you shouldn't have done wrong. But what people are failing to understand, when there were no wraparound services to help individuals when they are being released, these young people end up going back to what they did before and end up doing worse than before they went in. So we have a duty of care, all of us, to understand that the rehabilitation isn't just in the prison, but it's for when they come out as well.
I mean, it's one way of dealing with things, or is this sort of liberal wishy-washy thinking? One way of dealing with it is to get gangs who are at loggerheads with each other to talk to each other, to create dialogue. Is that something that can happen, or is that a no-no?
No, that can happen. I used to do that, mediation. That is what I've been trained in. I've been trained in dealing with gang mediation throughout this country. So yes, that can happen. The problem is there's not enough organizations out there trained in that arena to deliver that. That's another thing that needs to be looked at, to be bottomed out, in terms of how can we get that to come right across the UK? Because again, we're not looking at gangs in London, it's gangs right across the UK. How can we get organizations that can actually deliver that piece of work so that actually we can stop young men going into the criminal justice system before it happens? We can actually look at mediation, looking at joining a kind of peace treaty between the gangs, so that way these young men do not end up in the criminal justice system and actually can move out of that gang life situation. So mediation can work, but it's at this moment, I do not think the funding is there to do that piece of work.
But that is something that the local authority could look at as well, that mediation process.
Yeah.
Okay, and I mean, we're getting very close to the end now. So, I mean, do you want to just say right at the end, I mean, what is your view of the future? Do you think it will get worse before it gets better, and will it get better?
I think with the right vision, that means the Prime Minister with the right vision for young people can make things get better. But at the moment, we need a person that has a vision for young people. That means thinking into the future. Yes, it's going to get worse, and I'll tell you why it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse because communities, white and black and Asians, are not looking at themselves, they're blaming. And so until when communities acknowledge their responsibility, what is happening in their communities, it's going to be very difficult for the government to actually come in and do anything, because they don't admit there's a problem, or they admit there's a problem, but they want to blame the government for the problem. There is a 50-50 problem we have to look at. 50% of the problem is government. There's no doubt about that. Bad housing, education, and that kind of employment. Then there's 50% of problem, the community, absent fathers, broken families, mothers who are struggling, mothers that got mental issues, children that's got mental issues, violence within the family home. These issues have to be addressed amongst the communities so that we can work together with the local authority and the police, because I don't believe this is a police problem. I know everyone wants to blame the police, but it's not a police problem. This is a social issue, and has to be tackled on a social and a mental issue, mental health issue. So if we keep looking at enforcement and trying to blame the police, we're not going to solve the problem. We can't look at interventions, because interventions can only work when you have a stable family unit. So for me, until when the communities can come together and the government work together along with the police to find a strategy that works in various communities, that has got the cultural differences and it's not a one size fits all, then and only then we may begin to see some changes. But that's a few years from now.
Okay, so there is hope for the future if we take the right action and we think in the right way. Okay, well, actually, Sheldon, that was fantastic. I think that presentation was really great, and I'm sure people really appreciated it because, you know, I think you've given such a sort of presentation in depth with your understanding and experience no one else probably could have. So, you know, thank you for doing that.